The Mujahideen camps of Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Muslim men and boys in Afghanistan are trained primarily for jihad, holy war, and militant activities. Here's a detailed breakdown of what their training involves. What are the Mujahideen trained for? 1. Military training and jihad. Combat skills. The Mujahideen camps provide military training from early morning until sunset. Boys and men are taught how to use weapons, make bombs, and carry out suicide missions. Jihadist indoctrination. The training is not just physical, but also ideological. The Mujahideen are indoctrinated with the belief that it is their religious duty to wage jihad against infidels, non-Muslims, and to restore the Islamic Caliphate. They are taught that dying in jihad is the highest honor and guarantees paradise. 2. Religious education. Quranic and Hadith studies. The camps emphasize learning the correct teachings of the Quran and the authentic Hadiths, sayings, and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. This religious education is used to justify and motivate participation in violent jihad. Obedience to religious authority. The Mujahideen are taught to obey their emir, commander, without question, even if ordered to commit acts of violence against their own family members. 3. Gender roles and oppression. Women and girls. In these camps, women and girls are not trained for combat, but are instead confined to domestic roles. They are denied education, forced into early marriage, and subjected to strict gender segregation and oppression. 4. Psychological and social conditioning. Martyrdom and sacrifice. The Mujahideen are conditioned to see martyrdom, dying in jihad, as a desirable outcome. The environment is so harsh that many see death as an escape from suffering. Hatred of the West. The training includes anti-Western rhetoric, teaching that the greatest enemies are the United States, Israel, and other Western countries, and that it is a religious obligation to fight them. Direct quotes from the novel. Men and boys are required to attend military training from early morning until sunset, learning how to make bombs and carry out suicide missions. The camps are described as dirtier and more miserable than any place Irshad has ever seen, worse than living in hell, and the only hope for many is to die as a martyr and escape the suffering. He tells Irshad that as a Muslim man, it is his duty to join the training camps of the Mujahideen for jihad, referencing verses from the Quran and hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad to justify his decision. Mustafa is influenced by the Caliph figures like Osama bin Laden, who established jihadist bases in Afghanistan and invited Muslims worldwide to join the fight against the infidels and to restore the Caliphate. Summary table. Mujahideen training in Afghanistan. Aspect. Description. Military skills. Weapons use, bomb making, suicide missions. Religious indoctrination. Quranic/Hadith study, obedience to emir, justification for violence. Gender roles. Boys trained for jihad, girls/women confined to domestic servitude, denied education. Psychological conditioning. Martyrdom glorified, hatred of the West, readiness for violence. Living conditions. Extreme deprivation, filth, disease. Joining the Mujahideen camps in Afghanistan. Mustafa gives Irshad several reasons for moving from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan, rooted in his increasing religious radicalization and sense of duty as a Muslim man. After returning to Saudi Arabia, Mustafa becomes more content and deeply attached to his homeland and Islamic culture, feeling a sense of belonging he never experienced in Australia. However, his transformation is also marked by growing involvement with extremist groups and a belief that it is his religious obligation to join the jihadist camps in Afghanistan. He tells Irshad that as a Muslim man, it is his duty to join the training camps of the Mujahideen for jihad, referencing verses from the Quran and hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad to justify his decision. Mustafa is influenced by the Caliph figures like Osama bin Laden, who established jihadist bases in Afghanistan and invited Muslims worldwide to join the fight against the infidels and to restore the Caliphate. He believes that participating in jihad is a religious imperative and that his children should be raised in an Islamic society, not in the land of the infidels, like Australia. Direct quote from the novel. The Arab husband did not give any convincing reason to his foreign wife except that as a Muslim man, he understood that it is his duty to join the training camps of Muslims for jihad. The truth of the matter is that the Arab man, without the knowledge of his Australian woman, began a long time ago to mix with young Saudis who have great enthusiasm for jihad in the path of God. Through that group, he came to know that there is a wealthy and devout Saudi business tycoon named Osama bin Laden, who had spent millions of dollars and established a base for jihad and started inviting Mujahideen Muslims from all over the world to join his army in their training camps in Afghanistan. In those Islamic camps, the Mujahideen learn the correct teachings of the Holy Quran and the authentic hadiths of the blessed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. They will also be provided with the necessary military training to wage jihad war against the infidels. Mustafa's motivations are thus a combination of personal fulfillment, religious zeal, ideological commitment, and a desire to raise his children within a strict Islamic environment. Mustafa's decision to move from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan is a pivotal moment in the novel, deeply affecting Irshad's life and choices. Mustafa tells Irshad that his motivation is rooted in religious duty and the call to jihad. He is influenced by his growing radicalization, his connections with other young Saudis enthusiastic about jihad, and the influence of figures like Osama bin Laden, who established training camps in Afghanistan for the purpose of waging holy war against the infidels and restoring the Islamic Caliphate. Mustafa believes it is his obligation as a Muslim man to join these camps, receive military training, and participate in jihad against Western powers and their allies. He frames this move as a fulfillment of religious duty and a step toward a pure Islamic life, away from what he sees as the corrupting influences of the West and even the compromises of Saudi society. These reasons have a profound impact on Irshad's decisions. Although she is deeply reluctant and fearful, knowing that Afghanistan is a dangerous and primitive place, especially for women, she ultimately chooses to follow Mustafa. Her decision is driven by her love for her children and her fear for their safety if left behind. Irshad's sense of maternal responsibility outweighs her personal desires or safety. She feels trapped by legal, cultural, and religious barriers that prevent her from leaving with her children. Mustafa's insistence and the ideological pressure he exerts leave her with little real choice. She can either abandon her children to a future she dreads, or accompany her husband into a life of even greater hardship and risk. This moment marks a turning point where Irshad's agency is severely constrained, and her actions become increasingly focused on survival and the protection of her children, even at the cost of her own well-being. In summary, Mustafa's reasons for moving are religious zeal, the call to jihad, and a desire to live in a society he sees as more authentically Islamic. Irshad's response is shaped by her maternal devotion and lack of viable alternatives, compelling her to follow him into greater danger for the sake of her children's future. Here are the Quranic verses and hadiths that Mustafa quotes in the novel to justify his belief that, as a Muslim, he must join the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Quranic verses quoted by Mustafa.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, Verse 216.
Fighting is ordained for you, and it is hateful to you. You hate a thing, and it is good for you. And you love something. It is bad for you, and God knows, and you do not know. Mustafa uses this verse to argue that jihad, fighting, is a religious obligation, even if it is difficult or unpleasant. Surah Al-Anfal 8, verse 39, and verses 65 to 67. And fight them until there is no fitna and the religion is entirely for Allah. And if they desist, then Allah is all-seeing of what they do. O Prophet, instigate the believers to fight. If 20 of you are patient, they will defeat 200, and if there are 100 of you, they defeat 1,000 of those who disbelieve, because they are a people who do not understand. Now God has lightened your burden, and He knows that there is weakness among you, so if there are 100 patient ones among you, they will overcome 200, and if there are 1,000 among you who will overcome them. They fulfilled 2,000, God willing, and God is with the patient. It was not for a prophet to have prisoners until he thickens the earth with blood. Do you want the goods of the world? And God wants the hereafter, and God is mighty, wise. These verses are cited to show the necessity and virtue of fighting for Islam. Surah Al-Tawbah 9, verses 5, 29, 123. Then when the sacred months have passed, kill the idolaters wherever you find them, meet them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush. If they established prayer and paid zakat, so let them go their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving, merciful. Fight those who do not believe in God nor in the last day, and who do not forbid what God and His Messenger have forbidden, and who do not follow the religion of truth from those who have been given the book, the Jews and Christians, until they may pay the jizya willingly while they are humbled. O you who have believed, fight those of the disbelievers who come close to you, that is, the closest, then the closest of them, and let them find harshness in you, that is, be harsh with them, and know that God is with the righteous, with aid and victory. These are used to justify fighting non-Muslims and enforcing Islamic rule. Surah Muhammad 47, verse 4. So, when you meet those who disbelieve, smite the necks until, when you have suffocated them, then tighten the chains, so either from us after, or as a ransom until put down the burdens of war, and if God willed, He would have won victory over them, but that He might test one another with one another. And those who were killed in the battlefield God will not mislead their deeds. This verse is cited to emphasize the violence of jihad. Hadiths quoted by Mustafa. The Prophet Muhammad said, I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that there is no God, but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, and perform the prayers and believe the obligatory duty. Sahih al-Bukhari. On the authority of Abu Huraira that he heard the messenger of God, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, say, I have been commanded to fight people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and believe in me, messenger from the Lord, and in all that I have brought. And when they do so, their blood and fortunes are guaranteed for me except in cases justified by law, and their affairs are upon God. Sahih Muslim. The Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, said, I have been commanded to fight people until they testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is His servant and messenger, and they face our Qibla and eat what we eat. And they slaughtered what we slaughter and prayed like us. If they do so, their lives and property are forbidden to us, except for what is rightfully theirs. Sunan Abu Dawud. A man came to the messenger and said, a man fights for the spoils of war, another man fights for fame, and a third fights for ostentation. So who among them fights for the sake of God? The Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, said, he who fights for the supremacy of the word of God, Islam, fights in the cause of God. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. The messenger of God said, God guarantees whoever strives in His cause and motivates to get out of it except for jihad in His cause and faith in His word. He will enter paradise, if he is martyred, or return him to his abode. Sahih al-Bukhari. The messenger of God said, know that paradise is under the shadows of swords. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. The messenger of God said, there is no emigration after the conquest of Mecca except for jihad. When a Muslim ruler calls you to fight in jihad, you must immediately go out and heed the call. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 4, Book 52, Hadith number 311. Summary: Mustafa uses these verses and hadiths to argue that jihad is not only permitted but required for Muslims, and that joining the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is a religious duty. He presents these texts to Irshad as divine commands that override personal safety, comfort, or family unity. The religious texts, Quranic verses, and hadiths quoted by Mustafa have a profound and far-reaching impact on the plot of For the Sake of My Children. These texts serve as both the ideological foundation and the practical justification for Mustafa's radicalization and his decision to uproot his family from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan. By invoking verses that command fighting, jihad, and the supremacy of Islam through violence, Mustafa frames his actions as divinely mandated and non-negotiable. This religious rhetoric not only legitimizes his choices in his own mind, but also exerts immense pressure on Irshad, stripping her of agency and forcing her into compliance for the sake of her children's safety. As a result, the plot is propelled into a cycle of escalating danger and suffering. Irshad and her children are thrust into the heart of Taliban and al-Qaeda territory, where the risks of indoctrination, violence, and loss multiply. The religious texts thus act as both a catalyst and a cage, driving the family deeper into peril while making resistance seem both sinful and futile. Irshad's struggle to protect her children, her repeated attempts to escape, and her eventual transformation into an advocate for abused women are all shaped by the initial invocation of these texts. Ultimately, the novel uses these scriptural references to critique how religious authority can be weaponized to justify oppression, violence, and the erosion of personal freedom, especially for women and children. The novel offers a powerful and explicit critique of using religious justification for violence, particularly through the lens of its protagonist, Irshad, Susan. Throughout the story, religious texts, Quranic verses, and hadiths are repeatedly invoked by characters like Mustafa and other male authorities to legitimize acts of violence, oppression, and control, especially against women and non-combatants. The narrative exposes how these texts are selectively interpreted and weaponized to rationalize everything from domestic abuse and forced marriage to jihadist violence and terrorism. The critique is multi-layered. Religious authority as a tool of oppression. The novel shows how religious leaders and patriarchal figures use scriptural authority to silence dissent, enforce obedience, and justify cruelty. For example, Mustafa silences Irshad's objections to violence and abuse by quoting verses and hadiths, making resistance seem sinful or blasphemous. Violence as divine command. The text highlights the danger of interpreting religious duty as a mandate for violence. Mustafa's decision to join the Mujahideen and uproot his family is presented as an act of faith, but the consequences are devastating. Irshad and her children are plunged into war, deprivation, and trauma. The novel questions the morality of any ideology that places obedience to violent commands above compassion, justice, or individual conscience. Impact on women and children. The story is especially critical of how religious justification for violence disproportionately harms women and children. Irshad's suffering, her loss of autonomy, exposure to abuse, and inability to protect her children is directly linked to the invocation of religious texts as absolute law. The novel portrays these justifications as both a personal and societal tragedy. Transformation and rejection. Ultimately, Irshad's journey is one of awakening and resistance. Her eventual rejection of the religious justifications for violence and her advocacy for women's rights serve as the novel's call to question, challenge, and reform interpretations of faith that enable harm. The narrative suggests that true morality and justice require empathy, critical thinking, and the courage to stand against oppressive dogma, even when it is cloaked in religious language. In summary, the novel condemns the use of religion as a shield for violence and oppression, urging readers to recognize the human cost of such justifications and to seek a more compassionate, just, and questioning approach to faith and authority. The Mujahideen camps described in For the Sake of My Children are depicted as harsh, primitive, and deeply oppressive environments, especially for women and children. When Irshad and her family arrive in Afghanistan, they're assigned a small tent as their living quarters. The camps lack basic amenities. There are no toilets or showers, so men and women must relieve themselves in the wilderness, and children urinate and defecate behind their tents, creating an unbearable stench. Flies and mosquitoes are everywhere, and dangerous insects like snakes and scorpions are common. There is no electricity or lighting except for kerosene lanterns, and no means of entertainment or communication with the outside world. Women and girls are confined to their tents, as the Taliban government has closed all girls' schools and banned women from learning to read or write. Their daily life consists of domestic chores, cleaning, washing, cooking, and providing sexual pleasure to their husbands. Every woman and underage girl is married, often at a very young age, and there is no concept of child abuse or protection. The camps are run according to strict interpretations of Sharia law, with corporal punishment for any perceived disobedience. Men and boys are required to attend military training from early morning until sunset, learning how to make bombs and carry out suicide missions. The camps are described as dirtier and more miserable than any place Irshad has ever seen, worse than living in hell, and the only hope for many is to die as a martyr and escape the suffering. Conditions of women and children in the camps. The general living conditions in the Mujahideen camps, as described in the novel, are extremely harsh, unsanitary, and dangerous, especially for women and children. The camps are depicted as primitive and lacking basic necessities. Overcrowding and poor shelter. Families live in small tents with no toilets or showers. Men and women must go outside to relieve themselves, and children often defecate behind the tents, creating a pervasive stench and unsanitary environment. Lack of clean water and electricity. There is no electricity or lighting except for kerosene lamps. The water supply is unreliable, and basic hygiene is nearly impossible to maintain. Health hazards. The camps are infested with flies, mosquitoes, snakes, and scorpions. Disease is rampant, and medical care is virtually non-existent. No education or entertainment. Girls are forbidden from attending school, and women are confined to domestic duties. There are no opportunities for recreation or personal development. Constant danger. The camps are under threat from military attacks, and the risk of violence is ever present. Women and children are especially vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Extreme gender segregation and oppression. Women are required to wear the niqab or burqa at all times, even inside the tents, and are not allowed to leave without a male guardian. Their lives are strictly controlled by religious law and the men in the camps. A direct excerpt from the novel describes these conditions. There are no toilets or showers in these tents. Men and women go out into the wilderness to answer the call of nature, while young boys and girls poop and urinate behind their tents. Thus, there is a stench that is impossible to inhale without contracting a dangerous disease. Flies by the billions during the day and mosquitoes by the millions at night. Snakes and scorpions are as common as bits of dirty litter. The camps are dirtier than vacant places designated to get rid of the dirt of the city. There is no electricity or any kind of light except for the local lamps, which are called lanterns and are lit with kerosene. There is no way to entertain. The girls spend all their time in their tents because the Taliban government has closed all girls' schools and banned women from learning to read and write. Women have domestic duties such as cleaning, washing, and cooking during the day and providing sexual pleasure at night, and every few months in bearing children. Every woman and underage girl are married. There is no minimum age for marrying young girls, so girls younger than 9 or 10 years old were married off. There is no such thing as child abuse through physical beating, child marriage, or child soldiers in the Muslim world. This depiction underscores the novel's themes of deprivation, oppression, and the struggle for survival in an environment shaped by extremism and war. The impact of camp conditions on women and children in the novel is profound and deeply traumatic. The camps are depicted as places of extreme deprivation, danger, and oppression, which shape the physical, emotional, and psychological well-being of their most vulnerable inhabitants. Physical hardship and health risks. Women and children endure unsanitary living conditions, with no toilets or showers, exposure to disease, and infestations of flies, mosquitoes, snakes, and scorpions. The lack of medical care means that illnesses and injuries often go untreated, leading to chronic suffering and sometimes death. Loss of freedom and education. Girls are forbidden from attending school, and women are confined to tents, stripped of opportunities for learning or personal growth. Their lives are reduced to domestic labor and survival, with no hope for advancement or escape from their circumstances. Psychological trauma. The constant threat of violence, forced marriages, and abuse creates an environment of fear and helplessness. Children are at risk of indoctrination into extremist ideologies or being forced into child marriage or soldiering, while women face the daily reality of gender-based violence and exploitation. Social isolation and oppression. Strict gender segregation and religious laws isolate women and children from the outside world and from each other. Women are required to wear the niqab or burqa at all times, even inside their tents, and cannot leave without a male guardian. This enforced isolation deepens their sense of powerlessness and despair. Cycle of abuse. The oppressive environment perpetuates cycles of abuse, with women and children often becoming both victims and witnesses to violence, further entrenching trauma and limiting their ability to break free from their circumstances. Summary: the camps strip women and children of their dignity, safety, and hope, leaving lasting scars and shaping their futures with trauma, loss, and a relentless struggle for survival. The novel uses these depictions to highlight the urgent need for compassion, justice, and change. The psychological effects on children living in the Mujahideen camps, as depicted, are severe and deeply damaging. The novel describes a range of traumatic impacts. Chronic fear and anxiety. Children are constantly exposed to violence, instability, and the threat of abuse. They witness beatings, forced marriages, and even executions, which instills a persistent sense of fear and insecurity. Separation anxiety and loss. Many children are forcibly separated from their mothers due to legal, cultural, or violent circumstances. This leads to profound feelings of abandonment, grief, and confusion, as they are cut off from their primary source of love and protection. Exposure to indoctrination and abuse. Boys are at risk of being indoctrinated into extremist ideologies and trained as future fighters, while girls face the threat of forced marriage and sexual violence. Both are exposed to harsh discipline and physical punishment. Long-term psychological trauma. The cumulative effect of these experiences often results in behavioral problems, depression, withdrawal, and difficulty trusting others. The loss of maternal protection and the constant exposure to trauma leave lasting psychological scars. Direct excerpt from the novel. The repeated divorces create an environment of fear, instability, and emotional turmoil for the children. They witness intense arguments, violence, and the breakdown of their parents' relationship. This instability is compounded by the cultural and legal context, where the father's authority is absolute and the mother's position is precarious. The children see their mother being abused, beaten, and threatened with separation, which instills fear and anxiety in them. They are often used as leverage in conflicts between their parents, making them feel unsafe and powerless. After the third and final divorce, Irshad loses her legal status as Mustafa's wife and, under local law, her rights to custody of the children. The children are forcibly separated from their mother, which is deeply traumatic. This forced separation causes the children to experience abandonment, confusion, and grief as they are suddenly cut off from their primary caregiver. With Irshad removed from their lives, the children are left in the custody of their father and his extended family, where they are at risk of being indoctrinated into extremist ideologies, especially the boys, who are expected to become martyrs or jihadis. The girls are at risk of forced marriage and further abuse, as described by Irshad's fears for their future. The trauma of witnessing parental conflict, experiencing violence, and being separated from their mother leaves lasting scars. Some children develop behavioral problems, depression, or withdrawal. The sense of loss and betrayal can affect their ability to trust and form healthy relationships in the future. Summary: children in the camps endure a relentless cycle of fear, loss, and trauma, which shapes their development and leaves deep psychological wounds. The novel uses these portrayals to highlight the urgent need for protection, stability, and healing for children in conflict zones. Here are direct quotes from the novel that illustrate the psychological trauma experienced by women, particularly Irshad and others, in the camps and throughout their ordeal. On suicidal despair and the crushing burden of motherhood. She is suffering from a strong suicidal mood. She is deeply immersed in her suicidal thoughts. She tried many times to end her life, but she was always prevented by the fear of leaving her children orphans and begging for food on the streets of Kandahar city. If it is not for her children, she would have shot herself in the head and ended it all and got out of her hellish life in the Muslim world. On the loss of autonomy and identity. The Australian woman found herself is imprisoned in the four corners of her apartment in Dammam City, in the Islamic kingdom of Tartarus. She cannot go out without her Arab husband. There is no entertainment in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Australian wife can go out with her Saudi husband once or twice a month and go to the supermarket, which is a few meters away from her apartment. On the trauma of forced compliance and religious oppression. She has always convinced herself that the unbeatable problem is not in the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet, but rather in the interpretations of those divine texts. On the aftermath of sexual violence and humiliation. Never has the Australian woman felt more humiliated and abused throughout her life than when the ugly Somali man brutally raped her in her bedroom with full knowledge of her Saudi ex-husband. On the long-term psychological impact and coping. Irshad internalizes much of her pain, feeling isolated and powerless. She does not have a support system to help her process the trauma, and the cultural and familial pressures prevent her from openly expressing her suffering. This internalization manifests as ongoing emotional distress and a sense of hopelessness. On the trauma of losing her children and the sense of utter powerlessness. Irshad's refusal to return to her country without her children is a central theme of the novel, highlighting her maternal devotion, her fear for their safety and future, and the immense legal and cultural barriers she faces. Her children are her only reason for enduring unimaginable suffering, and she is determined to protect them at any cost. On the cumulative psychological toll. Irshad experiences depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and suicidal thoughts after her arrest, abuse, and forced separation from her children. She is stripped of her role as a mother, isolated, and stigmatized, leading to profound feelings of worthlessness and despair. Living under threat of further violence, legal punishment, and social ostracism, she develops chronic anxiety and a sense of powerlessness. These excerpts reveal the depth of psychological trauma endured by women in the novel, including despair, loss of identity, humiliation, isolation, and the enduring scars of abuse and separation. Here are direct quotes from the novel that illustrate women's coping mechanisms in the face of extreme trauma, abuse, and oppression. These excerpts focus on Irshad, Susan, and other women's strategies for psychological survival and endurance. 1. Suppression and endurance. Irshad initially copes by suppressing her pain and enduring the situation for the sake of her children. She feels she has no choice but to comply with the demands placed upon her, as her primary motivation is to keep her family together and protect her children from further harm. This endurance, however, comes at the cost of her own emotional well-being. 2. Emotional withdrawal. The trauma of the Muhalal event leads Irshad to emotionally withdraw from Mustafa. The trust and intimacy in their relationship are shattered, and she becomes distant, resentful, and unable to reconnect with him on a meaningful level. Her feelings for Mustafa are further eroded, and she struggles to forgive him for subjecting her to such an ordeal. 3. Internalization of pain. Irshad internalizes much of her pain, feeling isolated and powerless. She does not have a support system to help her process the trauma, and the cultural and familial pressures prevent her from openly expressing her suffering. This internalization manifests as ongoing emotional distress and a sense of hopelessness. 4. Focus on survival and children. Despite her suffering, Irshad's primary coping mechanism is to focus on the survival and well-being of her children. She continues to make sacrifices and endures further hardships to ensure their safety, even if it means suppressing her own needs and desires. 5. Long-term impact. The novel suggests that the trauma of the Muhalal event has lasting effects on Irshad's mental health and her ability to trust others. It becomes a defining moment in her journey, shaping her later decisions and fueling her eventual resolve to escape her circumstances and advocate for herself and her children. 6. Summary. Irshad copes with the aftermath of the Muhalal event through endurance, emotional withdrawal, internalization of pain, and a relentless focus on her children's well-being. The experience leaves her deeply wounded, but it also contributes to her eventual transformation into a survivor and advocating for women's rights later in the novel. These passages show that the women in the novel, especially Irshad, survive by enduring pain in silence, emotionally withdrawing from their abusers, internalizing trauma, and focusing on their children's safety as a source of strength. Over time, these coping mechanisms both scar and empower them, ultimately fueling their transformation from victims to advocates. Irshad's psychological state in the Mujahideen camps is one of profound trauma, despair, and psychological deterioration, but she also demonstrates remarkable endurance and survival instincts. Here's a summary of her psychological state and coping mechanisms. Irshad's psychological state. 1. Severe psychological distress. Depression and suicidal thoughts. Irshad is depicted as suffering from deep depression and recurring suicidal ideation. She feels immersed in her suicidal thoughts, haunted by the overwhelming suffering and the bleak future facing her children. She repeatedly contemplates ending her life, but the thought of leaving her children alone and vulnerable prevents her from acting on these impulses. Anxiety and chronic fear. Living under constant threat of violence, abuse, and the loss of her children, Irshad develops chronic anxiety and a sense of powerlessness. She is always alert to danger, both from the environment and from those around her. Post-traumatic stress. The cumulative effect of witnessing and experiencing violence, abuse, and repeated losses leads to symptoms consistent with PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance. 2. Loss of identity and isolation. Loss of autonomy. Irshad's sense of self is eroded by the extreme restrictions placed on her as a woman in the camps. She is stripped of her freedom, voice, and agency, leading to feelings of worthlessness and despair. Social isolation. She is cut off from any support network, her family, friends, and even other women, due to language barriers and cultural differences. This isolation deepens her psychological suffering. 3. Enduring trauma and hopelessness. Despair and hopelessness. The relentless hardship, abuse, and lack of escape routes foster a sense of hopelessness. Irshad often feels trapped, with no control over her fate or her children's futures. Guilt and self-blame. She experiences guilt for not being able to protect her children from harm and for the choices that led them into such danger. Irshad's trauma profoundly affects her relationships throughout the tale. Her experiences of abuse, violence, and loss shape how she connects with others, both during her time in the Mujahideen camps and beyond. Here's a detailed explanation. 1. Emotional withdrawal and isolation. Detachment from loved ones. Irshad's repeated exposure to violence and betrayal leads her to emotional withdrawal, even from those she loves. She becomes distant and struggles to trust, making it difficult to form or maintain close bonds. Loss of intimacy. The trauma she endures, especially sexual violence and humiliation, destroys her sense of safety and intimacy. Her relationship with her husband, Mustafa, is irreparably damaged after episodes of abuse and the Muhalal event, leaving her unable to reconnect with him on a meaningful level. 2. Maternal relationships. Overwhelming protective instinct. Irshad's trauma intensifies her attachment to her children. Her love for them becomes her primary reason for survival, but it also leads to anxiety, overprotection, and guilt. She fears for their safety constantly and is haunted by the idea of losing them or failing to protect them from harm. Guilt and self-blame. She blames herself for the suffering her children endure, believing her choices have led them into danger. This guilt sometimes creates emotional distance, as she feels unworthy or powerless as a mother. 3. Relationships with abusers. Fear and compliance. Trauma conditions Irshad to comply with her abuser's demands to avoid further violence. She suppresses her own needs and desires, leading to a loss of agency in her relationships with men like Mustafa and Mullah Abu Hamid. Resentment and anger. Over time, her suffering transforms into resentment and anger toward her abusers. This fuels her eventual resistance and desire to escape, but it also makes reconciliation or forgiveness impossible. 4. Trust and support networks. Difficulty trusting others. Irshad's repeated betrayals and lack of support make it hard for her to trust new people. Even when she finds allies, like Nadia and Noor, it takes time for her to open up and accept help. Reliance on shared experience. She is most able to connect with others who have endured similar trauma. Her friendship with Nadia, another woman who suffered abuse and oppression, is strengthened by their shared experiences, allowing for mutual support and understanding. 5. Transformation into advocacy. Empathy for other victims. Irshad's trauma deepens her empathy for other women and children. While it initially isolates her, over time it motivates her to become an advocate, using her story to support and empower others. Activism as healing. By helping others and speaking out, Irshad begins to reclaim her sense of agency and rebuilds healthier relationships based on solidarity and shared purpose. A detailed comparison of Irshad's life in Saudi Arabia versus her life in the Mujahideen camps, primarily in Afghanistan. 1. Physical environment and daily life. Saudi Arabia. Living conditions. Irshad lives in an apartment in Dammam, isolated from the outside world. She is not allowed to leave the house without her husband, and entertainment or social life is almost non-existent. The environment is restrictive but relatively clean and urban. Material comfort. While emotionally oppressive, there is access to basic amenities, medical care, though limited by financial and social constraints, and some family support from her husband's relatives. Mujahideen camps. Living conditions. The camps are described as primitive, filthy, and overcrowded. There are no toilets or showers. People relieve themselves in the wilderness, and disease is rampant. There is no electricity, and tents are infested with flies, mosquitoes, snakes, and scorpions. The stench is unbearable, and medical care is virtually non-existent. Material comfort. There is extreme deprivation, no privacy, no education for girls, no entertainment, and constant danger from violence and military attacks. 2. Social and legal restrictions. Saudi Arabia. Patriarchal control. Irshad is subject to strict gender segregation, must wear the abaya and niqab, and cannot travel, work, or socialize without her husband's permission. She is isolated from her family and friends, and her autonomy is severely restricted. Legal barriers. She cannot obtain passports for her children or leave the country without her husband's consent. Custody laws favor the father, and the Sharia court system is heavily biased against women. Mujahideen camps. Total oppression. Women and girls are confined to tents, forbidden from attending school, and denied any opportunity for personal growth. Their lives are reduced to domestic labor and sexual servitude. Forced marriage and child marriage are common, and there is no concept of child protection. Religious extremism. The camps are governed by the strictest interpretations of Sharia law, with corporal punishment for any perceived disobedience. Women are required to wear the niqab or burqa at all times, even inside tents, and cannot leave without a male guardian. 3. Psychological state. Saudi Arabia. Despair and isolation. Irshad experiences depression, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness, but her suffering is somewhat buffered by the presence of her children and occasional support from extended family. She feels trapped, but still has moments of hope and attempts to negotiate with her husband. Guilt and fear. She is haunted by guilt for not being able to protect her children and is fearful of the consequences of disobedience or escape. Mujahideen camps. Profound trauma. Her psychological state deteriorates further. She suffers from severe depression, PTSD symptoms, and recurring suicidal thoughts. The constant threat of violence, deprivation, and the loss of her children's future intensifies her despair. Hopelessness. The environment is so oppressive that she contemplates suicide, only prevented by her love for her children. She feels utterly powerless and isolated, with no support network. 4. Relationships. Saudi Arabia. With husband, the relationship with Mustafa is marked by increasing control, emotional and physical abuse, and religious justification for violence. She is silenced whenever she protests against practices like polygamy, child marriage, or FGM. With children, she is able to be physically present with her children, though always under threat of losing them if she disobeys her husband. Mujahideen camps. With husband, Mustafa becomes even more radicalized and eventually disappears, leaving Irshad and her children vulnerable to abuse by other men in the camps. With children, her ability to protect her children is further diminished. Boys are at risk of indoctrination and being sent to jihad. Girls face forced marriage and abuse. She is often separated from her children and loses custody under camp rules. 5. Coping mechanisms. Saudi Arabia. Suppression and endurance. Irshad suppresses her pain and endures abuse for the sake of her children. She tries to negotiate and find hope in small victories, but is often silenced by religious and social pressure. Seeking help, she attempts to seek help from embassies and friends, but is repeatedly thwarted by legal and cultural barriers. Mujahideen camps. Survival mode. Her coping narrows to pure survival, enduring pain, internalizing trauma, and focusing solely on her children's immediate safety. She becomes emotionally withdrawn and loses hope for escape. Transformation into advocacy. Over time, her suffering deepens her empathy for other women and fuels her later activism, but in the camps, her options are extremely limited. Summary table. Saudi Arabia versus Mujahideen camps. Aspect. Saudi Arabia. Mujahideen camps. Physical environment. Urban, restrictive, basic amenities. Primitive, filthy, overcrowded, no amenities. Social restrictions. Patriarchal, legal barriers, some family support. Total oppression, no education, forced marriage. Psychological state. Depression, isolation, some hope. Severe trauma, PTSD, hopelessness, suicidal thoughts. Relationships. Abusive husband, can be with children. Husband radicalized/dies, children at extreme risk. Coping mechanisms. Suppression, endurance, seeking help. Survival mode, emotional withdrawal, later activism. In summary, Irshad's life in Saudi Arabia is marked by emotional and legal oppression, but with some material comfort and hope. In the Mujahideen camps, her situation deteriorates dramatically. She faces extreme deprivation, constant danger, and total loss of autonomy, leading to profound trauma and a relentless struggle for survival. A focused comparison of Susan's Irshad's life before and after marrying Mustafa. Susan before marrying Mustafa. 1. Family and social life. Raised in a loving, supportive Christian family in Sydney, Australia. Her parents, Frank and Mary Peterson, are nurturing and invested in her education and well-being. She dreams of becoming a diplomat, is curious about other cultures, and enjoys freedom and autonomy. She has friends, social activities, and the ability to make her own choices about relationships and education. 2. Personal identity and aspirations. Susan is independent, ambitious, and open-minded. She is interested in learning languages and exploring the world. She has a strong sense of self and is guided by her family's Christian values. 3. Early romantic experiences. She has a brief relationship with a Chinese student, which ends in disappointment but is handled with her family's support. Even after an unplanned pregnancy, her parents help her, allowing her to continue her education and pursue her dreams. Susan after marrying Mustafa. 1. Social isolation and loss of autonomy. After marrying Mustafa and converting to Islam, Susan, now Irshad, becomes increasingly isolated from her family and friends. She is pressured to conform to strict religious and cultural norms, including changing her name, dress, and daily habits. Her autonomy is gradually stripped away. She is expected to be obedient, modest, and submissive. 2. Life in Saudi Arabia. Irshad is confined to her apartment, unable to go out without her husband. She is cut off from her family, has no social life, and is forced to comply with strict gender segregation and religious rules. She experiences emotional and physical abuse, and her husband uses religious texts to justify his control and violence. She witnesses and is forced to accept practices like polygamy, child marriage, and female genital mutilation, despite her objections. 3. Psychological impact. Irshad's mental health deteriorates. She suffers from depression, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness. She copes by suppressing her pain and focusing on her children's survival, but her sense of self and hope is deeply eroded. 4. Life in the Mujahideen camps. Her situation worsens dramatically. She and her children live in extreme deprivation, filth, and constant danger. She loses all remaining autonomy, is exposed to violence and trauma, and is reduced to survival mode. Her psychological state reaches its lowest point, with PTSD, suicidal thoughts, and a relentless focus on protecting her children as her only anchor. Direct quotes illustrating the change. Before marriage. Susan Peterson, the protagonist of the novel, is born and raised in Sydney, Australia, to a loving and deeply religious Christian family. Susan grows up in a nurturing environment, dreaming of becoming a diplomat and working abroad, which fuels her fascination with foreign languages and cultures. After marriage, Saudi Arabia. The Australian woman found herself imprisoned in the four corners of her apartment in Dammam City, in the Islamic Kingdom of Tartarus. She cannot go out without her Arab husband. There is no entertainment in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Australian wife can go out with her Saudi husband once or twice a month and go to the supermarket, which is a few meters away from her apartment. After marriage, camps. There are no toilets or showers in these tents. Men and women go out into the wilderness to answer the call of nature, while young boys and girls poop and urinate behind their tents. The camps are dirtier than vacant places designated to get rid of the dirt of the city. There is no electricity or any kind of light except for the local lamps, which are called lanterns and are lit with kerosene. The girls spend all their time in their tents because the Taliban government has closed all girls' schools and banned women from learning to read and write. Women have domestic duties such as cleaning, washing, and cooking during the day and providing sexual pleasure at night, and every few months in bearing children. Every woman and underage girl are married. There is no minimum age for marrying young girls, so girls younger than 9 or 10 years old were married off. Summary table. Aspect. Before marriage, Susan. After marriage, Irshad, Saudi Arabia, and camps. Family/social life. Loving, supportive, free. Isolated, controlled, cut off from family/friends. Autonomy. Independent, ambitious, hopeful. Submissive, powerless, survival-focused. Psychological state. Optimistic, confident, curious. Depressed, anxious, traumatized, desperate. Environment. Safe, nurturing, opportunity-rich. Oppressive, abusive, deprived, dangerous. Identity. Strong sense of self, Christian values. Loss of self, forced religious/cultural transformation. In essence, Susan's life before marrying Mustafa is defined by love, freedom, and hope. After marriage, as Irshad, she is gradually stripped of her autonomy, subjected to abuse and oppression, and forced into survival mode, her psychological state shifting from optimism to trauma and despair. Here are the key moments of Susan's identity shift after marrying Mustafa. 1. Conversion to Islam and name change. Moment. Susan converts to Islam to marry Mustafa, adopting the name Irshad. Significance. This marks the first major break from her Christian upbringing and family identity. The name change is symbolic of her new religious and cultural allegiance and is required by Mustafa as a condition for marriage. Quote, "The last condition that her Muslim friend demanded of her, which annoyed her, was to change her name." Susan realized that the only thing that still connected her to her past life was her precious name. Mustafa wants her to pass away from her former self and be reborn into a Muslim girl to be religiously and racially qualified to marry him. Once again, she is carried away by her blind love and agrees to change her name to Irshad. Of course, her Arab lover chose this Muslim name. Irshad means dedication to learning the teachings of Islam. It also means religious guidance for the sake of God and His Messenger. 2. Adoption of Islamic dress and practices. Moment. Irshad is required to wear Islamic dress, abaya, niqab, stop using perfume, and follow strict rules about her appearance and behavior. Significance. This is a visible, daily reminder of her new identity and the loss of her previous freedoms. She is no longer allowed to dress, act, or socialize as she did before. Quote, Irshad is obligated to dress and behave like a well-mannered Muslim girl. She bought an Islamic dress that covered her body from head to toe, except for her face and a small part of her hands. Her Saudi lover told her that the Quran commands all Muslim women to wear the veil. The white girl was also forbidden to wear shirts, pants or slacks, and any short dresses. Of course, Irshad is now completely forbidden from wearing a bikini or visiting any pool or beach. She is not supposed to do any physical sports such as basketball, football, volleyball, running, swimming, or going to the gym. She is also forbidden to shake hands with men. 3. Severing ties with family and friends. Moment. After marriage, Susan is pressured to cut off contact with her Christian family and Australian friends. Significance. This deepens her isolation and marks a psychological break from her past, reinforcing her dependence on Mustafa and his world. 4. Internalization of new beliefs and suppression of doubt. Moment. Irshad tries to reconcile her suffering with her new faith, convincing herself that the problem is not with Islam, but with its interpretation. Significance. She suppresses her doubts and pain, internalizing the new identity even as it conflicts with her values. 5. Loss of autonomy and identity in Saudi Arabia. Moment. In Saudi Arabia, Irshad is confined to her apartment, unable to go out without her husband, and is forced to comply with strict gender segregation and religious rules. Significance. Her sense of self erodes further, and she becomes almost entirely defined by her role as a submissive wife and mother. 6. Transformation under extreme oppression in the camps. Moment. In the Mujahideen camps, Irshad's identity is reduced to survival and motherhood under extreme deprivation and violence. Significance. She loses all remaining autonomy and is forced into a state of psychological survival, with her only anchor being her children. 7. Emergence as survivor and advocate. Moment. After enduring years of trauma, Irshad's suffering becomes the catalyst for her transformation into a survivor and advocate for women's rights. Significance. She reclaims her voice and begins to fight back, using her story to help others and expose injustice. In summary, Susan's identity shift after marriage is marked by a series of profound losses of name, faith, autonomy, family, and self, followed by a gradual transformation into a survivor and advocate, forged in the crucible of suffering and resilience. Here's a summary of Irshad's, Susan's, spiritual struggles and growth. 1. Spiritual curiosity and openness, Australia. Beginning, Susan is raised in a loving Christian family with strong faith and values. She is open-minded and curious about other cultures and religions, which leads her to study Islam and eventually convert for love. 2. Conversion and identity crisis. Conversion to Islam. Susan's conversion is motivated by love for Mustafa and a desire to belong, not deep conviction. She changes her name to Irshad and adopts new religious practices, but this is accompanied by a sense of loss and sacrifice. She must sever ties with her Christian family and former identity. Early struggles. She tries to embrace her new faith, but quickly faces internal conflict as she is pressured to conform and suppress her doubts. The religious environment is strict and unforgiving, and she is told to accept everything without question. 3. Faith as a tool of oppression, Saudi Arabia and camps. Religious justification for abuse. In Saudi Arabia and later in the Mujahideen camps, faith is used by others, especially Mustafa and religious authorities, to justify control, violence, and misogyny. Irshad is forced to comply with practices she finds abusive, such as FGM, child marriage, and polygamy, all in the name of religion. Suppression of doubt. Whenever she questions or protests, she is silenced with religious texts. She tries to convince herself that the problem is not with Islam, but with its interpretation, leading to guilt, confusion, and spiritual pain. Spiritual despair. The constant use of faith to justify suffering leads to a crisis of belief. She feels abandoned by God, struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts, and loses her sense of spiritual comfort. 4. Turning point, questioning and awakening. Critical reflection. After years of trauma, Irshad begins to question the faith that has been imposed on her. She recognizes the gap between the ideals she was taught and the realities she endures. Seeking meaning, she starts to see her suffering as not just personal, but part of a larger pattern of religiously justified abuse. This realization becomes the seed for her eventual spiritual awakening and transformation. 5. Return to Christianity and spiritual reclamation. Reclaiming her faith. After escaping the camps and regaining some freedom, Irshad re-examines her beliefs and ultimately returns to Christianity. This is not just a religious change, but a reclaiming of her original identity and values. Faith as empowerment. Her renewed Christian faith becomes a source of healing, hope, and purpose. She finds strength in her spiritual roots and uses her story to advocate for others, exposing injustice and helping abused women. 6. Spiritual growth and advocacy. From victim to advocate, Irshad's spiritual journey moves from curiosity, through crisis and despair, to critical reflection and, finally, to empowerment. Her faith, once a source of confusion and pain, becomes the foundation for her resilience and activism. Quote, "Her journey is marked by religious conversion, loss, and ultimately a return to her original faith, reflecting the struggle for personal identity and spiritual truth amidst cultural and religious conflict." Summary table. Irshad's spiritual struggles and growth. Stage. Spiritual state and struggle. Growth/outcome. Australia, pre-marriage. Christian, open-minded, curious. Seeks understanding, values faith. Conversion to Islam. Motivated by love, not conviction, identity crisis. Loss of self, internal conflict. Saudi Arabia and camps. Faith used to justify abuse, doubts suppressed. Spiritual despair, crisis of belief. Turning point. Begins to question imposed faith, seeks deeper meaning. Awakening, critical reflection. Return to Christianity. Reclaims original faith, finds healing and empowerment. Spiritual growth, advocacy for others. In essence, Irshad's spiritual journey is a story of struggle, loss, questioning, and ultimately growth. Her faith is both a source of pain and, finally, the foundation for her healing and activism. Through suffering and reflection, she moves from being shaped by others' beliefs to reclaiming her own spiritual truth and using it to empower herself and others.